Okay, class, welcome to what should be day 8 of the Civil Rights Unit for Wednesday, April 22nd. A few quick reminders. I sent out some emails uh, to people who were still missing their Unit 9 test. This Friday is going to be the last chance to make that up, so you've got to respond to that email if you've got one of those. And first and seventh, you have a class goal. Make sure you scroll through that feed and see where you had that goal and what you need to do to accomplish that. So, oh, also make sure you just keep up with the class. It's going to be tougher to take this test if you've got to kind of watch all these videos at the last minute. So let's do a quick review of our objectives and what we did yesterday. So today we're going to focus a little bit more on how people turn to more violent forms of protest, and we're going to officially define martyr and give you quite a few, unfortunately, examples. So let's review first what we did yesterday. Uh, the formatives, so far, people are doing pretty decent, although they're missing number three. So, who won the 1960 presidential election? Well, most of you got that right, that it was JFK. Who rode buses throughout the South to test desegregation through passive resistance or civil disobedience? Of course, that was the Freedom Riders. What city was shamefully the center of brutal tactics against those practicing civil disobedience, including using water hoses, vicious dogs, and police brutality? So it's Birmingham. Montgomery's no picnic, but that's the location of the bus boycott. Birmingham, Alabama, are those infamous civil rights demonstrations where, again, police dogs and water hoses and just very offensive tactics used against peaceful protesters. Most people seem to get this right. What famous speech in 63 seemed to mark the moment in which the majority of Americans embraced Dr. King and his ideals? So, of course, that's the I Have a Dream speech, and with various descriptions of how moving, of course, that would be. All right. So, we also covered yesterday, we have two smaller sections. That's why there's going to be one formative for this. So, yesterday we talked about Lyndon Johnson and the 1964 Civil Rights Act and how he launched his Great Society to fight poverty. And there was great advancement, but there was still people being denied the right to vote through tactics like the literacy test. So you're going to see today people turning a little bit more violent, a little bit more aggressive in their protests. So this heading is Disappointed Hopes, and it is the last section for traditional sort of African American civil rights. Remember, we're going to have another unit, Unit 11, added onto this, which is covering all the other groups inspired to use the tactics of the civil rights movement. So, disappointed hopes. You have a lot of progress being made from 1954 in particular through this point, which is it's really hard to define when the movement turns. It's a slow thing. There's examples here and there. But by the mid 60s, you start to see more and more people calling for more militant actions. Completely logical. What you have is a movement that has been very patient. You've got a movement that really it doesn't ever stop. You know, once you have the end of slavery, you have various forms and stages of the civil rights, but we often just say the civil rights movement, meaning 1950s and 60s. Never forget, like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and others who were fighting for things way before this. So you already have a very understandable impatience, but Dr. King is trying to preach this sort of newer idea about civil disobedience. And there's tremendous progress made, but it seems like every time there's a step forward, it can feel like there's two steps back. And of course, there are far too many people who are dying for the cause, who are doing really simple things like trying to register to vote or doing absolutely nothing, minding their own business, and killed because of racism and hatred. And that is going to take its toll on people. And some, not all, some are going to turn to more militant forms. So I said in the notes you'll be able to identify a martyr. I think most of you are going to probably on the test say Dr. King or Malcolm X. Depending on who you believe killed JFK, JFK. Depending on the motive for what you believe Bobby Kennedy died for, you might say Bobby Kennedy. Those are sort of the obvious ones, and that's fine to use on the test. But I just don't want you to think that by any stretch those are all the martyrs. So the Southern Poverty Law Center, which does an amazing job of tracking any sort of hate group, any sort of racism going on in the United States, does an amazing job tracing sort of the heritage of hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan killing African American or civil rights protesters. And they just give you, and I'm not even saying this is a comprehensive list, but unfortunately, this list of people who are dying while fighting for civil rights or killed strictly because of racist reasons. And again, people grow more and more frustrated as you have more and more people very famously dying because of racist ideals or beliefs. And so, again, these moments, we talked about this one, the 4 children who died in that church bombing because that church, like many churches, was being used to register voters. So you just have far too many people being martyred for this cause. And by the way, you might notice that some of the martyrs happen to be white. If you are fighting for civil rights, black or white, you are killed, you are a martyr. And there were particularly college age students going down to the South. Again, ideally, if you're doing a sit in or your freedom rider doing a mobile sit in, you want black and white together because you're trying to desegregate an area. And so that just simply works better. So there's just far too many. And again, this isn't a completely comprehensive list, but that's why you have this growing frustration. And that seems pretty logical to me. So some African Americans began to seek black separatism, voluntary separation of the races, which seems to come full circle from where we were, which was the idea of fighting segregation. But I'll remind you of what I said back earlier. When the Brown versus Board case is fought, I told you, listen, if you happen to be Catholic and you choose to go to a Catholic school, that's not segregation because you are making the choice. This is how this was viewed by some black separatists. Uh, Segregation is illegal and immoral, but because of the history of experience some people had, they wanted to voluntarily separate. And that is a very different idea. You also see, and I think this was more common than black separatism, black pride. Pride and heritage of being African American became far more common, and it was exemplified or demonstrated in various things. But mostly, the most obvious, I'll say, would be in fashion and hairstyles. So, as far as fashion goes, this is, let's see if we can enlarge this. This is what we call a dashiki. So, this would be traditional African, I guess, shirt, but shirt kind of short sells it because traditionally they would often go down to about the knees. If we were in our classroom, you would see that I have some pictures of some students in some dashikis when we represented traditionally African nations at Model UN. Often very colorful. Sometimes during the Black History Month program, you will see some teachers express Black pride by wearing a dashiki or something along those lines. In addition, hairstyles. Now, this actually ties a little bit into uh, the hippie movement because what you're going to see is there's a big push by the late 60s and early 70s to just be as natural as possible. So whatever naturally would occur, that's how your hairstyle would be. So if you happen to be uh, like my uncles, kind of hippie influenced people in the 70s, they're going to let their hair grow long because if you just do nothing to it, that's what happens. Now I think about my uncle Bob in particular, and one of his better friends, Dean, and he happened to be African American, and by him not doing the same thing, not cutting his hair, letting it go natural, it ended up being really big, a little bit more indicative of this particular picture, except I'd say twice as big. And so you see people saying, "Hey, this is what is naturally occurring, so I'm going to have great pride in this." And again, that ties a little bit into the hippie movement because I think there's a misunderstanding. Hippies could be African American or white or Hispanic or Native American or whatever it might be. Now, sometimes though, uh, we'll tie this in a little bit more when we talk about SNCC. This also meant sometimes excluding white workers, which that seemed a little counterproductive to a lot of people, but I get the sentiment. Somebody who represents this frustration as well as anybody is Malcolm X. Malcolm X is a very, very interesting story. If you're if you're really bored, and really, I don't want to imply that it's boring. I'm just about to tell you that it's like a 4 hour movie. Uh, there is a fantastic movie about Malcolm X's life, uh, and it was one of the first big movies put out by Spike Lee. I know there were other movies before this. I think, yeah. Anyway, this Malcolm X is just this epic drama. It is. You've got Denzel playing Malcolm X, and again, it's I exaggerated. It's not 4 hours. It's 3 hours and 22 minutes. If you ever see it on TV, once in a while they'll play it on TV. They can stretch it out to about 5 hours because they've got to put in their commercials. So it's certainly a commitment, but I will tell you, it's amazing. It is very, very well done. But let me tell you a little bit about his story. So Malcolm X started off his life as Malcolm Little, and Malcolm Little got into a lot of trouble. I believe was thrown in jail for dealing drugs, and while in jail, he came across the Nation of Islam, which was it's kind of a combination of a Black Pride movement and the Islamic faith. And so the Nation of Islam took him in, and he started preaching some of the ideals of the Black separatist movement, which was part of the Nation of Islam, and of course the ideals of Islam. Again, it's kind of a combination of the two, and became just a very powerful speaker from within prison. Then once he is released, Elijah Muhammad, who was the president or top person in the Nation of Islam, noticed him and started bringing him up through the ranks, and eventually he rose to the number 2 position within the Nation of Islam. I think a lot of people think that Malcolm X was in charge of the Nation of Islam. He actually never was officially the top. He was, though, who most people saw. Uh, the man behind the scenes, who was technically ahead of him, was Elijah Muhammad. And Malcolm X, the name in and of itself, talks a little bit about uh, Black pride and the anger that some people felt. I told you originally his name was Malcolm Little. He adopted the name X to identify his lost, or to help highlight his lost identity. That he didn't really know his family name because it had been lost over the years through slavery. And so, what a lot of Nation of Islam members do is they'll change their name to a combination or one of the 99 holy names within Islam. And you may know some famous athletes who did this. So there's a famous Olympic boxer by the name of Clay, and then he becomes a member of the Nation of Islam, or at least there's some debate about how much a part of the movement and how much just in Islam itself. But he changes his name to Muhammad Ali. So those are some of those Muslim names. You have Lou Alcindor, who changes his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So you have, if you've ever seen names that maybe have some sort of combination of those, that's somebody who probably uh, was at the very least inspired by the Islamic faith. So Malcolm X is a counter to what Dr. King is saying. And I told you a long time ago when you had Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, you have these two men who have like sort of opposite strategies. One who, Booker T. Washington, who certainly doesn't accept segregation and what's going on, but sort of works within the system to fix it. Uh, and then you have W.E.B. Du Bois, who's asking for change right now and is much more upfront. And you would think that those two don't like each other. And publicly, sometimes they would say sort of derogatory things about each other, but behind the scenes, we know they're writing letters to each other, and you need them to counter each other. The same is true of Dr. King and Malcolm X. When you have Dr. King saying, we need equality now, and then you have some people who say, well, hold on, don't move too fast. You're asking for too much. Then you have Malcolm X say, maybe we should just kill all the blue eyed devils. Then you have a, a point of reference to go, wow, what Dr. King is asking for is not revolutionary, is not extreme. He's not asking for too much at all. You almost need Malcolm X there to exist to realize how insanely reasonable Dr. King's demands are. And so they play off of each other a little bit. But he certainly represents that more militant, that angrier aspect of the civil rights movement. Now, Malcolm X, it's a long story. If you watch the movie, you can get through it. Um, but Malcolm X eventually finds out that Elijah Muhammad is having affairs with young members of the Nation of Islam all over the country. It has all of these children, and Malcolm X is offended by this because it's not a very holy thing to do. And when he confronts Elijah Muhammad about it, Elijah Muhammad tells him he must be silent, uh, and he's not allowed to talk or preach for I can't remember how long, but a month. So he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, the holy land of Islam, and kind of rediscovered Islam in that trip. And because it sort of redefined his view of Islam, because the Nation of Islam does not have the same views as mainstream Islam. It is a mainstream Islam is a religion of peace. Most religions are, and he came back and definitely softened his views, and then established his own church, mosque, and the Nation of Islam. Then, because they felt threatened by this, assassinated him for softening his views, and I believe for providing a counter to the Nation of Islam. So I will say he still never openly agreed with Dr. King, although there's some people who will tell you that they were talking and agreed a lot more again, kind of like that other 1920s example I gave you, where you have men who agree a little bit more than you think. But he was assassinated in 1965 in front of his congregation by several gunmen with shotguns. It is pretty much accepted that a lot of people knew who the shooters were, but would not identify them for fear of what would happen to them. And so there's some conspiracy theories there about his death. I think people are pretty clear that the Nation of Islam killed him. Um, there's many will tell you one of the shooters is currently the leader of the Nation of Islam. But regardless, there's some discrepancy in the fact that nobody was ever officially charged with the crime. Absolutely insane. Okay, other more militant groups. I didn't really make you highlight this because I guess it's not on the test anymore, but I still think you should know. SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That was formed by Dr. King out of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and it was really more for college kids to learn about civil disobedience. Stokely Carmichael took over, I believe, in 1966, and he eventually rejected nonviolence. It is insane to me to believe, not insane for me to believe that people went to violent methods. I don't prove it, but I understand it. But it's insane to me that a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee then said things are too rough, we're going to violence. That's what shocks me, that that particular group under Stokely Carmichael uh, made that decision. Stokely Carmichael is one of the men credited with giving the symbol of the Black Pride movement, which was that raised, clenched black fist, and that became so predominant during that era. And then you see that little flyer here about the Black Panthers, but I'll come back around to that. So tension is increasing, and one of the areas you see this in is in the major urban area of LA. Watts is a suburb of LA. And in 1965, you had a huge riot over accusations of police discrimination. I don't even like the word accusations in there. It's in this particular case, it's absolutely over police discrimination. It starts over what people very sarcastically, and I know this sounds crass, I'm just telling you the term that they used at the time, what people very sarcastically called DWB, driving while black. Absolutely not a crime, and yet that's something that got you picked up in LA, especially if you were driving in quote unquote a white neighborhood. And so, at several occasions, uh, law-abiding African American men are driving in a car and they get pulled over by the police because it's two or three African American men in a car. And then when they assert their rights, they say something calmly like, "Hey, what are we being pulled over for? DWB?" Then you sometimes have these very illegal beatings and harassment and things like that. And instances like this boiled over and caused this huge riot that ended up killing 34 people, over 1,000 hurt, and $40 million lost. This is something that happens again in the LA riots, which are even bigger because Watts is again one sort of smaller area of LA, not a small area, but smaller compared to all of LA. And the LA riots, which are, I'm going to say, 1992, I believe, uh, over again what happens in LA in that year. Rodney King is a suspect who is pulled over and beat, and it's caught on camera, and that you have these riots. So this is this is something that is not as far back in our history, and of course, we know a million examples, unfortunately, in modern times that bring this up again. So this is that issue really coming to a head at first in the 1960s, and it certainly had happened before that. That helps explain groups like the Black Panthers. Black Panthers are a militant Black Power organization. They were particularly big in California, as a matter of fact. I mean, that's really where they are most predominant at the time. And the Black Panthers literally went into places like Oakland and said, okay, the police are too racist. The police cannot be trusted. So we will police these neighborhoods. And you had areas where men just openly had guns out in public and would say, okay, we're going to police and monitor this area, that area, or whatever it is. I mean, they were wearing ammo belts, and they were often identified by these berets. And so the Black Panthers would sometimes, to police parts of Oakland or whatever city they might be predominant in, would take somebody who might be accused of rape, black or white, and then leave their dead body at the police station, and it would just say rapist on their body or something like that. This is pretty revolutionary stuff, and at the time, tensions were so high that many times the police just let this go and said, "Okay, we're not going to go into this three-block area over here," which is just a mind-boggling thing to think of, that things were that crazy, that separatist, that bad. But I think the highlight of the or low light would be a better way to put it, of the sadness, of the desperation, of the number of martyrs would probably be the assassination of Dr. King. So the Dr. King assassination is again one of those conspiracies. Uh, we know who killed him. How much more is there to it? Uh, we'll get to that in just a moment. He'd begun to speak out against the war in Vietnam in addition to civil rights. I'd hinted about this earlier, but essentially, Dr. King argued pretty convincingly that the draft in Vietnam was racist because at the time, I believe African American population was it's 12 it is then and now right around somewhere in that 12 to 14% range. And if the draft was completely racially unbiased, then what you would expect is that 12 to 14% of the draftees would be African American. But it was something along the lines of about 25% of the draftees were African American. And so Dr. King was saying, listen, maybe not outwardly, but by the time you apply exemptions, uh, by the time you apply, these waivers that people had for being in college or for this or for that, it ends up being a de facto very racist draft. And he's still absolutely filing civil disobedience, but he ends up being assassinated in April of 1968. He is killed by a man by the name of James Earl Ray. I don't know if I have a little. I do. Um, James Earl Ray rents a hotel room across from the hotel where Dr. King was staying. This is Reverend Jesse Jackson. If you are familiar with him, he's absolutely been very active uh, beyond the assassination of Dr. King. Ran for president in 1984, was very prominent in the civil rights movement through 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, a little bit less lately. He's been getting older, but Dr. King was on the balcony waving to this picture was taken just moments before, waving to supporters, waving to friends, and James Earl Ray from this hotel room across the street gunned him down. Now, that seems pretty straightforward. Here's where you get into the conspiracy parts. James Earl Ray left the gun in the window, did not wipe down the fingerprints, and had registered the name in the hotel under his name. He then fled the country and was caught, I can't remember if it was weeks or months later, with a very sophisticated forged passport and a bunch of cash. Okay. Some people think there's a conspiracy right away because nobody's that dumb to assassinate a major symbol of anything, a famous person, and then have your gun that's registered to you with your fingerprints left in the window in a hotel room with your name on it. Like that makes people go, "Oh, this was too easy to catch this guy." Now you could argue this guy's like an eighth grade dropout. He's probably not that smart. Maybe it does all add up. Then how did he get all the cash, and how did he get the perfectly forged or almost perfectly forged passport? That's the big question. I personally believe James Earl Ray shot Dr. King, but I think it seems very obvious that someone hired him to do it. And in the eyes of the law, the person who hires someone to kill somebody is actually usually held one step more culpable than the other person. In other words, if Bob hires someone to kill Fred and Sam kills Fred, Bob is the one they go after for the death penalty, and Sam usually gets life in prison. They're both in tremendous trouble, but the person who initiated the thing is the person you ultimately want the greatest amount of punishment for. I feel like somebody probably hired James Earl Ray to kill Dr. King. Now, Dr. King's oldest son met James Earl Ray years later and had a meeting with him and came out and said, I don't even believe he shot my father, which completely blows my mind. I don't know what he told him. I don't know if he meant he was just a tool of some racist group. I don't know. But again, that's now we have in just a brief time period, we have JFK in 63, Malcolm X in 65, and Dr. King in 1968. And then, of course, Bobby Kennedy just a couple months later. Now, we had talked about this one already. But 1968, Bobby Kennedy was running for president, and he was so clearly for even more advancements in the civil rights movement. And he is gunned down. And I've already told you about the conspiracy theories there, where you have this man, Sirhan Sirhan, killing him, and you have uh, these some people saying we heard like 9 or 10 shots in this kitchen where he's killed, but there are only 5 shots missing from Sirhan Sirhan's revolver. So he certainly shot him, but did somebody else? The woman with the polka dot dress, and all this conspiracy stuff. But here you have 4 major world leaders, all of which, to some degree, were in favor of civil rights. Although I think the JFK assassination is less likely to have to do with civil rights. All 4 are gunned down. That's 4 major assassinations of major inspiring leaders who get gunned down. And it is just a low point in so many ways for the civil rights movement. Tomorrow, I'll give you a formative on this. I know I went a little long today. I apologize. This is some pretty important stuff. And soon we'll start transitioning into the other parts of the civil rights movement with, again, women and Hispanic Americans and Native Americans. Um, so, hope you got through today okay. Tomorrow, there will be less notes, I promise. And I hope everybody is staying safe out there. Have a good one.